Thank you again on behalf of ISQOLS for joining our webinar today, Globally Inclusive Measures of Subjective Wellbeing. I am pleased to introduce our speakers, Jessica Mahoney, a political analyst at the OECD Centre on Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equal Opportunity, better known as WISE. Her work focuses on well-being approaches to policymaking and measures of subjective well-being, social connectedness, and mental health. Our other speaker, Hinako Percival. Hinako is an associate registered nutritionist, soon to start her PhD at Massey University and looking for ways to improve the appointment letters sent to wait-listed diabetic patients awaiting publicly funded dietitian appointments. And then our other speaker, Conal Smith. Conal is a Wellington-based economist with interests spanning the economics of well-being, valuing intangible costs and benefits, social capital and trust, the behavioral drivers of economic outcomes, and social policy more generally. He led the development of the first international guidelines on the measurement of subjective well-being in 2013 and trust in 2017, as well as the OECD's first well-being themed country report. Kunal has worked on the policy applications of well-being measures in New Zealand, the OECD, and the developing world. Jessica, Hinako, and Hinako and Conal, I turn this over to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jill. Given that introduction, I don't think there's much need for us to do a who's who here. So we've organised this presentation in 3 bits. I'm going to stop talking in just a second and hand over to Jessica, who is going to give us the context for the OECD project of which this piece of work is part. And Jessica is going to talk probably for about 15 minutes. Then we're going to pass to Hinako, who is going to go over a literature review, which she's led, looking at globally inclusive measures of subjective well-being, trying to get a picture overall of what instruments are out there and currently in use. And again, Hinako will talk for about 15 minutes. And then at the end, I will wrap up, so hopefully pretty briefly in less than 15 minutes, leaving some time for discussions. So I'm not going to take much more time. I'm going to hand over directly to Jessica. Jessica, just nod or wave your hand like that or something when you want me to move through slides.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Conal, and good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it may be in your time zone. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks so much to ISQOLS for hosting us. Very, very happy to have the opportunity to share this work. And as Conal said, there'll be time at the end for a Q&A, and we really are interested in getting some feedback on this. So please do, put questions in the chat or think of them as we go forward. So you can go to the next slide, Conal. We've had a couple of intros, but my name is Jessica Mahoney. I am a policy analyst at the OECD Centre on Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equal Opportunity, or WISE for short. And as Conal said, before we delve into the specifics of this topic, which is globally inclusive measurement approaches to subjective well-being, I wanted to take a step back in this brief bit in the beginning, just to give you a better sense of some of the work that WISE does, but also to tell you how this project, this specific project, which Conal and Hinako will tell you more about, fits into our larger program of work, both in terms of subjective well-being, but also in terms of producing measurement guidelines more broadly. So many of you are no doubt familiar with the work that the OECD does, but very briefly, the OECD is an international organization. At its core, it has a few main goals: providing international guidance on measurement practice, producing policy recommendations, and also importantly, the OECD serves as a place that enables our member countries to come together and share best practices. Then within the OECD, the work of the WISE Center, very broadly, we can say, focuses on changing the narrative of what it means to have a good economy, what progress means, and also how to think about what matters the most for a good life. And that means for people, for the planet, and also for future generations. And a lot of that specific work is grounded in the OECD's well-being framework. And the well-being framework provides an example of a multidimensional approach to how we conceptualize and define and measure well-being. The framework has 11 dimensions of well-being in the here and now: It also has 4 capital stocks that reflect the sustainability of that well-being into the future. And the well-being framework covers material, relational, environmental, and civic outcomes, all of which contribute to what makes a good life. And importantly for this, the framework, the indicators that underpin this framework are both subjective and objective types of indicators. Next slide, please. So to move forward this work on the well-being agenda, an important part of the OECD's work is then to produce measurement guidelines. And these publications provide guidance to national statistical offices, or really any other type of official data producer, on how to collect data for different types of well-being concepts where no high-quality international harmonized official statistics exist yet. And the hope is that having very clear guidelines and recommendations can encourage more countries. So yes, OECD countries, but really these guidelines can be used by anyone, so encouraging their use more broadly globally, to include these types of well-being indicators in official surveys. Next slide. So the goals of our measurement guidelines include a few things: improving the quality, consistency, and comparability of different types of well-being measures, also better defining concepts, outlining some key findings from the evidence base on reliability and validity of these existing instruments. And measurement guidelines also cover survey methods, design, provide guidance on the specifics of questionnaire design. So this is looking at question wording or response scales, survey administration, and so on. And here on the slide on the right, you'll see a few examples of OECD measurement guidelines that have come out in the past. So these focus on topics like trust, micro-statistics on household wealth, distribution of household income, consumption of wealth, and importantly, of course, for this topic, subjective well-being. Next slide, Connell. In 2013, which at this point was over a decade ago, the OECD wrote the official guidelines on how to measure subjective well-being. You'll see that cover there on the left. And this publication has specific recommendations, including a 5-question core module, and I'll show you that in a few slides. But it's a much more comprehensive publication than just one module. So very briefly, all of the types of things that are included in it touch on concept and validity, methodology, survey design, and sampling, but also output and analysis, so including considerations for how these data might be useful in policy discussions. And throughout the report also includes extended modules that have more examples beyond the 5-question core of different types of recommended indicators. Next slide. Subjective well-being, as it's defined then in this 2013 guidelines, are good mental states, including all of the various evaluations, both positive and negative, that people make of their lives, and the affective reactions of people to their experiences. And this overarching umbrella definition is then further refined to identify 3 distinct conceptual components that underpin it. Life evaluation measures are general assessments that people make about their lives, and usually it's captured with a question about how satisfied someone is with their life. Affective measures capture people's feelings, emotions, or states. And then eudaimonia refers to psychological flourishing, and this contains components of meaning and purpose, but also maybe autonomy, competence. Next slide. So as I said before, the guidelines is a very rich, detailed publication, but the main recommendations stemming from this report really can be distilled into a core module, which you see here. And this core module contains 5 different questions. So the first is a question on satisfaction with life. The second is a question about having meaning and purpose in one's life. And then there are 3 affect questions referring to how happy, worried, and depressed the respondents felt yesterday. Next slide. So everything that I've just said has to do with the 2013 guidelines. But since last year, WISE has been re-engaging with our work on subjective well-being. The idea is that now that the guidelines have been out in the world for over 10 years, we want to understand its impact. And so to that end, there are a few questions that are motivating this work. We want to understand whether countries are integrating the recommended subjective well-being indicators into their official surveys. This is one of the main goals of creating the guidelines in the first place. We want to understand which recommendations have been adopted, which ones haven't, and whether we know why that's the case. And then in addition to this scoping work, we're also reviewing advances in the literature so we can understand whether there are any gaps in our existing recommendations or whether there might be some new research areas that have come up in recent years where guidance from the OECD could be welcome. So all of this work will then be synthesized into an updated and expanded version of the OECD guidelines for measuring subjective well-being, and we anticipate publishing that in late 2025. Next slide. And as a result of all of this work that we've done, we've honed in on 4 priority areas that we want to focus on when we're doing this updated and expanded version of the guidelines. So first is to refine existing recommendations. And so we plan to refine our recommendations on measuring affect and eudaimonic well-being. And there's sort of like a very brief overview of what that might entail on the left. And then secondly, we want to look at new thematic areas and introduce some experimental and extended modules on these. So the first is measuring subjective well-being in children and young people. And then the second are globally inclusive approaches to measurement. And the latter is what we'll be talking about today. So in order to do this work, we're partnering with expert consultants for each of these 4 research areas. And these consultants will be drafting some in-depth technical papers on each topic. We're partnering with Connell's team at Quotata Insight on the 4th area, that is the globally inclusive ways of defining and measuring subjective well-being. And so today's presentation is going to focus on this specific research topic, outlining the questions, the approach, some early findings, and then also next steps. So next slide, please, which will be the last from me. You'll hear more about this from Quotata, but the project here is motivated by the premise that a lot of the literature in the subjective well-being field, but really in psychology, economics, and many other academics areas more broadly, pulls from globally non-representative samples. And often a lot of these studies are using Western European or North American samples. So we want to understand what lessons then we might learn if you broaden that literature base to include more voices, more perspectives, and evidence, both by including different and a wider expanse of countries and regions, but also looking at diverse population groups within these countries. And additionally, the project is going to look at existing measurement instruments that have already been developed for specific population groups or cultural contexts. One example of what that means more concretely, you can see here on the screen. This was a question developed by Statistics New Zealand, and I think we'll hear more about it, both its development and also some of its statistical properties later on in the presentation. So with that, I'm going to conclude my kind of intro and scene setting bit, and I'm going to hand it over to Hanako, who's going to discuss some of the early findings from the literature review. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. If we could go to, yeah. Hello, my name is Hinako Percival. I'm currently a PhD student at Massey University in New Zealand and an early career associate at Quotata Insight. If we go on to the next slide, please. As part of this Quotata Insight project commissioned by the OECD, I've been working with on a literature review on globally inclusive measures of subjective well-being. As Jessica just touched on, the vast majority of the well-known well-being measures are based on Western European, North American literature, and therefore Western concepts of well-being. In this review, we were most interested in finding existing measures that are specifically developed for non-Western populations or approaching well-being from non-Western lens. Also being here in New Zealand, where we do have a few well-being frameworks and measures developed through the Māori worldview, the Indigenous people of New Zealand, we did have a particular interest in seeking out other measures developed for and by Indigenous peoples. And the next slide, please. For this review, we searched across various databases, but with well-being research being quite broadly categorized under numerous fields such as psychology, philosophy, public health, and economics, there was some challenges seeking out the literature on well-being measures. But thanks to Connell, who reached out to many of his contacts across the world to help with any leads on existing measures. And this was especially helpful, not only to be directly introduced to literature that we would have otherwise not have found, such as some of the Japanese literature, which was not published in English, but also to broaden our search terms. Some of the terms suggested by these contacts included good life or good living, which actually captured many of the Indigenous literature that we included in this review, as well as terms like ikigai or buen vivir and other terms that were used interchangeably with well-being in specific countries and cultures. Aside from this, using specific country names and ethnic group names helped to pick up some of the smaller studies across smaller populations. Next slide, please. So in total, 19 measures across 9 different countries were found. The 9 countries being Canada, United States, Mexico, Bolivia, Cameroon, Indonesia, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. All of these measures, except for the 3 in Japan, focused on Indigenous peoples of the land, but not all of these measures were developed by the Indigenous people. You may also notice that most of these measures are still originating from the Western Anglophone countries. As you would see on the map here, a lot of these measures are from the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The only measures that were not from that side of the world was the community-based wellbeing scale in Mexico, the open-ended questionnaire looking into Bolivia, Cameroon, and Indonesia, and the 3 scales from Japan. With that said, the open-ended questionnaire was developed for a Western population and but was seen as culturally adaptable to other populations due to its open-ended nature, and was included in this review as it looks into 3 countries that had little to no wellbeing literature. The measures that are highlighted yellow on this slide indicate the measures which have validity and reliability tested, and with its validity and reliability and items published. I say this because some of these measures on the map here, such as the What Matters to Adults in Australia, the Youth and Young Adult Wellbeing Measure, which is a youth-led measure across 3 ethnic groups in North America, and the Glean Scale looking at Alaska Natives, is currently undergoing the validity and reliability stage, and the final items and results are not yet published. And the government-led measures such as Te Kupenga in New Zealand and the 2017 Nunavut Health Survey in Canada have little publicly available information, so these are also not highlighted here. And the next slide, please. So to summarize, this is the initial findings from the literature review looking at existing non-Western wellbeing measures. There is a total of 19 measures across 9 countries. Most of these non-Western wellbeing measures were still developed in the English-speaking Western countries across USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but they were developed for and by Indigenous peoples of the land. There is a clear gap here with no wellbeing measures developed across Africa, Middle East, South America, and aside from Japan, there was no measures developed in Asia. But we were limited to the English publications, aside from the Japanese articles that were included. So there may be more measures out there, especially if they are not published in English. And if you are aware of any measures that we haven't included, please get in touch with Connell or myself. We are in contact with some of the authors of the measures that are still going through that finalization of the measures and the items, and are looking to continuously update this review across this year while shifting the focus onto the larger project, which Connell will speak more about. And that is all from me. Thank you for listening, and I will pass it on to Connell.
Good, thanks, Hinako. And a list of the references there. So what I'm going to talk about now for the next 10 or 15 minutes is essentially where the project goes from here. So Jessica's talked about the origins of the project, what it's trying to achieve. Hinako's talked about what we found in our initial sort of first cut literature review. I think Hinako emphasized at the end there, and I'm going to return to this, that one of the characteristics of sort of this topic, globally inclusive measures of subjective well-being, is that there isn't one place to look for these measures, right? So in some questions you get, there's a literature, if you want to know about the effective income on subjective well-being, there's a handful of journals and they all cross-reference each other, and you go that and you do a search covering the EconLit database, with a few key terms in there, you're going to turn up everything that there is. One of the things that was evident, I think, even in the review Hinako did, is that there are some quite disparate literatures there. So there is a cluster of papers coming out of Japan. There is another cluster of papers largely within the public health literature, looking at Indigenous well-being. But a real challenge here has been there's no central point where this issue of globally inclusive measures of subjective well-being comes up. Right, so next steps. I'm going to start with this This is, I think, the most influential drawing I've ever done. It was from the original guidelines of subjective well-being, and it was intended as a kind of broad kind of diagram to get a sense of, okay, there are three concepts which Jessica mentioned. There's life evaluation, there's affect, and there's eudaimonia, which in turn have sort of subdimensions behind them. One of the issues with publishing the OECD, putting its weight behind something like the guidelines, is that NSOs take it very, very seriously. And while most of the reason this picture is influential isn't me, it's the OECD's weight and the fact that the diagram itself is describing something which is really basically Ed Diener's idea. But having published this, it means that a lot of the existing research and data collection by national statistical offices in particular has focused on a relatively narrow set of measures, and we've sort of assumed, and you often see people saying subjective wellbeing has these three dimensions. So part of this project is, as Jessica mentioned, testing the degree to which that's true, and there are a few elements to it, right? One, we're interested in the degree to which evidence from economic, sociology, psychology literatures underpinning the recommendations made in the original guidelines on subjective well-being may be overly focused on certain population groups, countries, or regions. Secondly, we're interested in measurement instruments. We want to identify which measurement instruments already exist for globally inclusive measures of subjective well-being. And we want to be able to look at, are there cross-cutting themes among different examples of culturally specific measures? And those themes, I think, are a key point of what we're trying to do, because while we'll want as many examples as we can find, a set of guidelines that says everything is completely unique and has no transferability isn't actually of much practical use. Hinako's initial literature review goes directly to this issue of measurement instruments. The project is going to be very concerned with validity and reliability. One of the key things that made the initial guidelines on subjective well-being influential with national statistical offices, I think Jessica would know the exact figures better than me, but I think it's about 31 out of 34 OECD countries that have at least the overall life satisfaction measure.
I think some form of life satisfaction at all, it's 37 out of 38. There's more countries now than when you were at the OECD.
Of course, this shows how long I've been away from the OECD.
Yeah, and a little bit less than that are, exactly in line with the guidelines, but it's a pretty high number.
But when you consider that when the first guidelines were launched, that number was 2 out of 34, it's a big change. And that was built on the fact that the original guidelines were able to assemble a solid base of evidence about the validity and reliability of those core measures that Jessica showed. So one of the things that we're really going to be interested in this project is, what do we know about the validity and reliability of some of the other measures that have been put up, and potentially what are the ways to start building that evidence if it doesn't exist? And finally, data collection. Can we develop lessons on good practice for official data producers when developing globally inclusive measures of subjective well-being? So evidence base, what do we have? There's a bit of a literature out there, which I suspect most of you are aware of, this notion of weird people: Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic. So this is the population base that a lot of our core psychological and economic literature is based on, because the data is better there. That goes to the rich. These are rich countries. They've traditionally been able to afford a relatively high level of data collection. A lot of the academic institutions that are doing economic and psychological and sociological research are in those countries, and so our evidence is on people from those countries. So one of the core things we want to do here is try and push those boundaries a little bit. I've got the this is from Our World in Data, results from the Gallup World Poll on life satisfaction, and I'll just bring it up because up until about mid-2000s, when you talked about life satisfaction, there was often this response of, oh, life satisfaction doesn't capture much. Everybody, gives a response of about 7. All right, 7 out of 10. It's always 7. And there's no variation. There's no variance in this. It wasn't until we got the Gallup World Poll, which enabled us to look beyond Western Europe and North America, where we discovered that the stylized fact of a strongly rightwardly skewed distribution, you can see it there under North America and New Zealand in the green in the middle, wasn't representative of life satisfaction. It was representative of the fact that we'd only been asking about life satisfaction in relatively wealthy countries. Once we got a global picture, we realized that, in fact, the global distribution of life satisfaction is something approaching a bell curve. So it really matters where you get your evidence from. Secondly, we've got some evidence. There's quite a large literature on the issue of cultural response bias in subjective well-being measures. So can you compare life satisfaction responses from Latin America and North America? And there's actually a fair bit of literature looking at this. This is not a core focus for this project. So when we talk about globally inclusive measures of subjective well-being, we're not really intending to go into the issue of cultural response bias. We're looking actually at, have we got the concept right, or are there other concepts we're not covering, not measurement issues? And if you're interested in measurement issues, there is actually an existing pool of papers out there, which I would summarize as saying there is some evidence of cultural response bias, but it's not actually large relative to the effect sizes we're looking at, and doesn't rule out cross-cultural comparisons. So the evidence base is one focus for this. Measurement instruments. So a core part of this is what Hinako's been focusing on, and it's going to be a core part of the paper, is reviewing the measurement instruments that are out there. There are a few themes we can identify, even from the initial review that we've done, that we can identify looking across. One theme that comes through in a lot of the Indigenous measures is concern with collective well-being. That is, with family or community as the unit that experiences well-being. So this is one, and this is clearly quite a strong distinction from measures of life satisfaction, which or happiness, which tend to be quite individually focused. Example here from Hinako's review, community-based well-being scale from Mexico, or similarly from Australia, the Strong Souls Aboriginal health measure. So there's a focus on family well-being that comes through. There's a typo. There's a solid, not stolid. I'm not commenting on the writing style. There is a solid body of evidence on measures of affect, largely focused on East Asia. So a lot of the literature coming out of East Asia, although if you look in some other places, a couple of the Bhutanese well-being survey, a focus not simply on the high arousal affect measures like happiness, but low arousal measures of positive affect, contentment, calm, balance. So there are a list of things coming out there. Just another example also from Japan. Third theme that's come through, even from Hinako's review, is a concern with connection, both to others and to the environment. And there is you can have a reasonable debate about whether this reflects a specific aspect of well-being or a conception of well-being, or if it's a determinant of well-being. But certainly the theme around connection and identity with the environment comes through strongly. So here from the Glean scale, and if we keep looking, from the Good Spirit, Good Life scale, right? So concern with connections to land, the place, and environment. Reliability and validity. This is the third of the themes which needs to be addressed. I think I've mentioned before that the reason the first set of guidelines were influential was because we had a large body of evidence on the reliability and validity of these measures, and we were able to when confronted with skeptical national statisticians or economists from treasuries, we're actually able to say, look, we know these things predict other proxy measures of overall well-being which are credible. They predict biophysical correlates of well-being, stress hormones in the blood, smiling frequency, left brain, right brain activity. They predict real world behavior, which always goes down a treat with economists, right? Revealed preference. For most of these measures which are focused on Indigenous well-being or going beyond those core set, we have less evidence on reliability and validity. So one good example, as far as I know, the only measure of well-being built out from an Indigenous, the only measure of subjective well-being built out from an Indigenous concept of well-being in official statistics, regularly collected in official statistics, is the whānau well-being question used in New Zealand. So whānau is a Maori word which loosely translates as family. Okay, so it means something. It doesn't quite mean a nuclear family in the Western sense. It's assumed to go a little bit wider. And for the Māori Social Survey, Te Kupinga, back in 2013, Statistics New Zealand, in addition to asking life satisfaction, asked the question on the right of the screen here. Now, how's your whānau doing? How would you rate how your whānau is doing these days from 0 to 10? So we've now got about 10 years worth of that data. We've had that data for 10 years in New Zealand. There has been very little actual systematic analysis of what whānau well-being is telling us relative to life satisfaction. The two regressions on the left are from a paper I did with a couple of co-authors a few years back. And if you look at them, they show that whānau well-being has similar relationship to some of the main determinants of life satisfaction, but not exactly the same. And if I just move over here, this is just the same information presented differently. We know that a person's subjective health status has roughly twice the impact on their life satisfaction than it does on their assessment of their whānau well-being, whereas perceived safety, the ability to walk alone in your neighbourhood at night, has roughly twice the impact on whānau well-being than it does on individual well-being. So with this measure, whānau well-being, we have a little bit of literature in New Zealand, 2 or 3 papers which look at it, which suggest it does something a little bit different to life satisfaction, and that the results are also basically plausible. They at least meet a face validity test. For a lot of the measures covered by the literature review that we've been able to identify, we don't even have this, and we have nothing close to the level of testing that life satisfaction got, for example, between 2000 and 2010. So this is an area of sort of key focus for the paper, and an area we're going to need to try and build as much evidence as we can. Finally, data collection. And I'm going to use another New Zealand example here just because that's what I've been doing for the past sort of 5 or 6 years. So the Tairāwhiti Wellbeing Survey. This is a survey run by Trust Tairāwhiti, or a social services funder in the Tairāwhiti region in New Zealand. Tairāwhiti is a remote rural region. It's quite large in terms of land area. It's tiny in terms of population, total population under 50,000. The Trust decided they needed to collect wellbeing data. They manage quite a large asset portfolio, which their deed requires them to invest for the wellbeing of the people of the region. And they have relatively little, they found they had relatively little information. The key point, I'm bringing this up apart from the fact that when you're somebody who is actually interested in evidence, it's possible to collect it, is they put together a wellbeing survey and took this out in an area which is largely rural, and is the only region in New Zealand where more than half the population is Indigenous. So the majority population in the Tairāwhiti region is Māori. Going out with that, they got, with a snowball sampling strategy, 2 years in a row now, they've reached more than 2% of the region's total population in survey response. So in the context of declining response rates worldwide, the Trust has managed to get a response rate that is actually quite staggering and hold it up between waves. This is probably because the Trust is seen as having strong local legitimacy, has really good ties to the community, and is an effective communicator as to why they're doing this, and feeds that back to the community. So, and for context, possibly it's also worth noting that the Tairāwhiti region was the region where Statistics New Zealand, when it conducted the last census, had the worst response rate. So there is information here which is relevant to this issue of globally inclusive wellbeing measures about how you communicate and connect and get data going beyond the mainstream of your population. So these are the areas we're approaching, and I've touched a little bit there on what I think some of the main sort of things that are emerging. Early days, but there are some key challenges we face. First, that Hanako's alluded to, the diverse and disparate nature of the literature. So there are relevant papers in the happiness, subjective well-being literature, often found in economics, psychology, sociology, a lot of the journals that ISQOLS associated with, but also in the public health literature and Indigenous studies papers. Secondly, and you will have seen from Hanako's map, when we did our initial sort of search engine-driven analysis, we found big geographical gaps where it was difficult to identify relevant articles. This includes large regions of the world where there were few, if any, papers on measurement. South Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America being the main ones. So even having sort of done an initial literature review and reached out through a bunch of different ways, we have gaps. There's a lack of evidence on validity and reliability. Many of the instruments we can identify have relatively little follow-up. And this is partly because the measures are coming from a whole bunch of different sources. It's partly because where life satisfaction was standardized relatively early on, and even where the measures were slightly different, it was clear they were talking about the same context, same concept. A lot of the measures we're looking at here are necessarily diverse. So there are gaps on the validity and reliability. The final challenge we're going to face with this is that context matters in measurement. Different things might matter in data collection as well as in instrument design, and we need to be careful about assuming that there is a generic, globally inclusive approach to this. So through my presentation, I think Hanako's, I can't remember whether Jessica mentioned this or not, but we've talked about Indigenous measures a few times, but it's worth remembering that Indigenous is not a population group or a culture, right? So there are vast cultural gaps between, say, Māori culture, the Indigenous population of New Zealand, and First Nations in Canada. Right, so in looking beyond the sort of standard set of measures, we need to take seriously that the world is a very diverse place. So, next steps, and I'm going to shut up after this and throw it open to questions. One of the reasons for holding this webinar is that the approaches, we're really trying to reach out to as many people as possible through as many different avenues as possible to identify papers or knowledge that we might otherwise have missed, so we can feed it into the guidelines. So this webinar is part of that. The last slide I've got has got my email address on, but really, really keen, echoing what Hanako said, that if any of you are aware of papers or bits of research which touch on this issue of non-Western, globally inclusive measures of subjective well-being, we would be immensely grateful if you could let us know. Jill mentioned the next ISQOLS conference, which really conveniently for this project will be held in Sabah, Borneo. So I'm chairing a symposium on globally inclusive measures of subjective well-being. They're trying to take advantage of the fact that we've got a whole lot of the world's scholars who are interested in this, getting together in a non-Western place to talk about this on Borneo. If any of you are able to make ISQOLS, or you know anyone who is, I really encourage you to try and find time for that on the Friday of the conference. The working paper will be drafted between July and September 2024. So we've had a bunch, we've done some initial literature reviewing. That literature review is still ongoing. We have this, we have the ISQOLS conference. Following that, we'll pull it together between July and September. Final working paper to the OECD in December 2024, and then the OECD will be hopefully releasing revised guidelines later in 2025. So key questions: are there any people we should contact who might be able to help? Are there any measurement instruments that you are aware of that we should include in the study? Guidelines on how data is collected that would be relevant here, and particularly, how can we encourage more studies on the validity and reliability of such measures rather than just the development of new metrics? Because I cannot emphasize this enough. We have comparatively speaking, a large number of metrics, particularly in the public health space. Relatively few go beyond something like a Cronbach's alpha. They're all multi-item scales for validity and reliability. And that might help a little bit with publication in an academic journal, but it's not going to get us far enough in terms of saying to skeptical audiences, this is valid, it captures something unique, it captures something different, it's meaningful. I'll leave that up there just for a minute now, but I'm going to hand over to Anthony to deal with questions.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carlo. Thank you very much, Hinako and Jessica. Yeah, we still have good 15 minutes. So let me first just say thank you for this great work and for this great presentation. I think it's particularly relevant for the ISQOLS community. As maybe some of you know, I am actually obsessed with your last question, Carlo, about validity and reliability. How do we push this further? And I just scrolled through the list of participants, and I can see some people in the audience that are also asking themselves this question, that are working on validity. So I think you have some people already in the list of participants, people with thoughts they would like to share. And before I share my own comments, I would like just to let the audience know that if you have questions for our presenters, please raise your virtual hand, and then Parviz and I will manage the Q&A. Okay, so before turning to the audience, I share with you almost everything about the need for more inclusive measures. How do we encourage people to work on the validity and the reliability? So I think one first thing I would like to highlight is that there has been last year in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology a special issue on how to build measures of well-being that are culturally sensitive. And Kuba Chris was the editor. So I will put in the chat the link to the special issue. Maybe you will have some insights coming from the special issue. And I'm just going to bring this also to the work I'm actually going right now. I'm involved in a project where we replicated all the papers in economics that has been published where there is at least one well-being regression. And so, as Connell knows, I think Connell, you saw me presenting last year at ISQOLS. We are working on the linearity and the homogeneity assumptions that were discussed by Bond and Lang. But another thing we are doing now, is that we are now doing this sort of big meta-analysis on this database. Like when you are an economist, which kind of population are you looking at? And we are always looking at working age population. So Jessica, you mentioned, the below 15. To this, I would add also the over 65. Like if you look at econ research, over 65, it's as if we are all dying after 65. The well-being of people over age 65, we have just nothing on this population. And the same goes when it comes to just regions of the world. In economics, we only have papers about the US, the UK, Germany, and Australia. The rest of the world just doesn't exist. And I think we really need collectively to make a big effort into collecting data everywhere in the world, and good quality data, so that we can finally produce papers to just convince audience that it's not only about this how did you say, Connell, the weird areas of the world. So completely on board with everything, and I would be very happy to share with you maybe the draft of our papers, or maybe even some slides. Maybe we can talk about it more later if you want. So all of this, I have absolutely no questions because I agree with you 100%. So very, very happy to hear all of this, and I learned a lot. Now I'm going to hand over questions to our audience. Parviz, do you have any question?
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks to Conal, to Jessica, and to also to Hinako. A great presentation. Thank you so much. I do have something to raise, if I may, and I very much appreciate the honesty that goes with the presentation. It was mentioned fairly early on, I think, that the question of the culture response bias is something that hasn't really been taken into account in working on this paper, and I think I don't have a solution for that, but I think it's a very important issue. I think one thing that I would suggest would be to actually define what you mean by culture, or what aspects of culture, because there's so much that is tied into that phraseology that can't be included, but I think there are some aspects of it that probably could. And I think it goes beyond linguistic issues, but something such as, say, intergenerational altruism, yeah? Something like that, I think would weigh quite heavily in the assessment of an individual or a society's measures of subjective well-being. And it's a great shame that the literature, for good reasons, has most of Asia, Middle East, large chunks of Africa and Latin America missing, because this question of I don't wish to engage in stereotypes, but this issue of intergenerational altruism, I think, is particularly strong in those societies, in South Asia and in Africa, in Latin America, are absolutely vital. So an individual's happiness or subjective well-being is very much tied with how much those individuals can offer their communities. And you have taken into the question of community engagement, which is really, really good to see. But I think more probably could be done. In terms of the measures, I think Connell raised that question towards the end. And inclusion of metrics, what types of metrics. I think what's really, really important is not just to think about which dimensions or elements are really important in the measurement of subjective well-being, but also assessment of the weights. Because unless you have a discussion of weights, then the presumption is that every single one of the dimensions that are listed have an equal part to play in the measurement of dimension. Maybe this was mentioned, and if it was, then I apologize for raising it here. But I think it wasn't mentioned. Weights are absolutely critical, and how you decide which elements carry more weight is itself not an easy task, and perhaps linked to the cultural response bias types of issues. So I really like the paper. I really like the approach. I really like the concepts raised. Pity that so much of the literature in those critical parts of the world aren't available. Although I'm a little bit surprised about South Asia, because India, the vast majority, and India, you're talking about 1/5 of the world's population almost, uh, and a huge amount of academic literature that is generated through Indian scholars and Indian research institutes and universities are available in English. So I think you should be able to find more than maybe the current search has thrown up. But I hope this doesn't sound critical, but I think it's a really good, it's a wonderful project, and I look forward to getting a chance to reading it when it's eventually published. So, but thank you again. Thank you.
And we actually have one very short question in the chat. Something that actually somehow relates to the weight of Parviz. Like someone, Muhammad Hamzan Ali, brought the question of climate change, and basically how is climate change incorporated in your approach? Like, is there some room for questions related to climate change?
So this is something that is more a process of discovery than us having a view up front. So what we're interested in is what measures are out there, what measures have been developed to reflect non-Western concepts of well-being. I strongly suspect that we're unlikely to find that climate change per se I might be wrong, is a fundamental sort of dimension of subjective well-being elsewhere. I think it's far more likely, and I think I alluded to this, that the environment itself, you find in a number of indigenous measurement instruments that we've seen that the environment itself is seen as possessing well-being. In fact, it's sometimes seen as an entity that possesses well-being, in which case I think you would assume that climate change is one of the things that affects the well-being of the environment. I noticed we have someone else with their hand up there. I've got a couple of points I can make about in response to Parviz, but I might let the questions keep coming rather than.
Exactly. We have two questions. There is one from Karen, and I also have Annie Tubaji after. So please go for it, and then we address all the questions at once. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Jessica Cohen and Haneko, for nice presentation. I am a PhD candidate here at the Erasmus School of Health Policy and Management in the Netherlands. And yes, I was quite interested about this presentation today because even in the economic field, well, basically in health, when we conduct economic evaluations, we see the importance of going beyond health for trying to find measures such as well-being. And I was, of course, curious because we have just conducted some studies in Latin America, basically founding of some instruments that were validated already in the Netherlands, that basically were motivated to have a broader scope in terms of domains, because I understand that well-being covers several domains that are not related to mental health. So we saw that it was important to cover, for example, items such as financial situation that plays an important role also in Latin America. Also, for example, safety, that is also a critical domain. So yeah, I would really like to get in touch at some point because I don't want to maybe extend this. Maybe there will be the chance. But yeah, I would really like to share about the work that has been conducted here that eventually can provide some additional insights. But thank you so much for motivating this space, all of you.
Annie?
So thank you very much for the wonderful effort that you're doing there with this study and for the interesting presentation. I would like to make briefly just two interventions. The one about culture, because I was very happy to hear about the special issue. And I would like to highlight how much I agree and how much literature there is on the relevance of cultural relativity across space, which is related to heterogeneity in the behavior of people on the same topic, given the same conditions. So in other words, if you do not factor in the cultural belonging of people in terms of space and in terms of the groups that they belong to, there will be a lot of unwanted heterogeneity, there will be internal clustering, and the whole model will be biased. And more specifically, you cannot achieve, Pravis actually was right when he was saying that it is not only language issues, because culture is a more complex entity, and you actually have to quantify it carefully in order to have all of it in the model. Otherwise, you are under quantifying an important element and under specifying the whole model, right? So there is a source of, first of all, clustering and unwanted heterogeneity coming from culture, and then just throwing in something cultural is not enough. You have to actually quantify culture properly in order to do all the job about culture. And the second aspect about the validity, it might be worth exploring the relationship between religion and happiness. So there is a lot on loneliness and religion, which is showing that when people are lonely, which supposedly means they're not happy, or, you know, we can assume that this might be likely for most of them, then there is a strong relationship with religion. The more lonely you are, the more unhappy you are, the more you need the support and mental. And on the other side, religious people are happier. This also, I think there is a pocket of literature there about that. So this will be a measure which is relevant. And then also nowadays, the turn to religiosity is associated with political voting, which is an expression of people's unhappiness, also socioeconomic issues. So this might be not only for validity, but in terms of a field of research, it can be valid. So that's from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have, let's say, 2 or 3 minutes for responses. So Conal, Hinako, Jessica, the floor is yours.
I might make a couple of quick responses. Firstly, Karen, hopefully you can see my email there. Just send me a message. Be really great. Secondly, the last commentator there, that whose name I missed. So particularly the comment you made on validity there is actually really helpful, because it's something I hadn't thought of. But actually, I know I'm familiar with the literature on religion, happiness and loneliness, and sort of what you're pointing out there is actually a potential way into external validity. One of the other themes that came through quite strongly in Hinako's literature review was spirituality. And so I think you're absolutely right. It's well worthwhile going back over that and having a look at that, see if we can pull out, because loneliness is something that can potentially be measured, be used as an external proxy for convergent validity. So that's a really useful thought. Pavis, a couple of things there. On the gap in South Asia, there are 2 things going on there. One, we have actually identified a couple of papers since then. The Bhutanese have obviously done a whole bunch of stuff in this space, and we found 1 or 2 other papers in there, although they're not great on subjective well-being measures, right? There is a huge Indian literature on well-being, but not much actually on measurement of subjective well-being, and in particular the focus of this study, which is trying to identify globally inclusive measures, so measures of subjective well-being grounded in non-Western views. Okay, and there's not much of that in India as far as I can see. I suspect there's some. I personally suspect part of that is actually that, you know, sort of Amartya Sen is so foundational in the economics of well-being and is such a high-profile Indian philosopher and economist. I suspect that a lot of the Indian literature has kind of gone down that route rather than focusing on subjective well-being, which is a little bit more normal. But we have found a couple of papers since then, and actually it's worth noting we've also found one scale from Indonesia, which has actually been quite well tested, that we'd missed initially. There's a bit of literature about. The other thing which I think I'd come back to really clearly is being clear about what this project is. This project is about exploring whether there are concepts of well-being not reflected in the sort of standard evaluation, affect, eudaimonia space, or within those. So in affect, for example, going beyond happiness, sadness, anger, worry. So we're interested in this. We're not primarily trying to identify all the literature and cultural response bias. There is a large literature on this on which we're sort of aware that's more or less out of scope, not because it's unimportant, but because it's not the question we want to answer. And some of the points that have been raised there, for example, like what is meant by culture. One of the slides I showed, which had a map of the world with sort of countries in different colors, that's from a paper by Carrie Exton, Claire Vandendrish, and myself a few years ago. That actually has quite a good definition of culture up front in it. I don't know, Hinako, Jessica, do you want to add anything?
I don't know, Hanako, if you have any thoughts. I don't have too much, and I'm also aware of the time. So just thanks to all of you so much for your feedback, really helpful. Very briefly, because I don't think, Connell, you talked on this yet, this question that Parvi's raised about weights. It's not so much maybe directly relevant, although we didn't kind of explain it, but sort of at least for now, the view that the OECD has taken on weights is that, we use a multidimensional approach for well-being, and that's true as well for all of the constructs underneath well-being, including subjective well-being, meaning we're looking at separate indicators. We're not combining them into a single index, in which then the weights question would be relevant. And that's for a number of reasons, one of which precisely as you identify is that kind of the value you assign to each weights and sort of the assumptions and the decisions you're making thereby have a really big impact on the number. So I won't kind of get into that whole decision, but for the purposes of this, we're looking for a set of kind of recommended indicators, and we won't be weighting them to create a single index. That's it from me though, but thanks again to all of you. I've been taking some notes on some of the things you've raised.
Yeah, I would echo my thanks as well, my huge thanks as well. I've been taking a bunch of notes for this.
In this case, well, thank you very much, Hinako. If ever you want to say a couple of words, feel free to do so.
I think Connell covered everything, but yeah, thank you from me as well.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I think you have here, you can still see the contact of Connell if ever you want to reach out, if you have more references, some thoughts, I guess you can just use Connell's email. And let me thank you again, Hinako, Connell, Jessica, for this great presentation. And I guess I'll see you at ISQOLS in Borneo for some of you, right?
Yep.
Okay.
See you on board. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.